So in this video, I'm going to talk about the historic caves of Connecticut. And Connecticut isn't really known as a state with a lot of caves, but we do have a lot of history, and the caves that are found here do have interesting stories. And in this video, I'm going to go over these caves that I've gone out and explored and documented, and even in some cases 3D mapped, and I'm going to talk about the stories behind these caves. So let's start with what's probably the biggest cave in Connecticut, and that's Twin Lakes Cave. And back in the 1860s, two men were hunting, and they were out with their dogs, and one of the dogs disappeared, and where the dog ended up was actually in this cave. And they thought it was an animal den, but they went back like a week later or so, and they actually explored the cave. So what they found was likely the largest cave in Connecticut. So as typical entrepreneurs of the Victorian age, they commercialized this cave, and they actually made it a little bit more accessible to bring people into the cave from a nearby train station. So they blasted out some of the rock in the tunnels to make it easier to access, and they charged 10 cents for entry. And of course, also in Victorian fashion, they added a dance hall and other amenities nearby, so that even though the cave was the attraction, it was probably a great place for people to hang out on the weekends coming up from New York City. The cave was extensively explored and mapped in the 1930s, and there was even some tales of this creature called the COLEBROOK that lived in the cave that was said to be kind of like a hybrid between a wolf and a panther, but had suction cups on its paws, and there was all sorts of stories involving hunting this COLEBROOK, and it was even said to have been once killed and mounted, stuffed and mounted and displayed at the World's Fair. But of course this was all like a publicity stunt with these very early cavers back in the 1930s. So I visited the cave around the early 2000s and filmed and documented some of the tunnels. After that time, the cave became inaccessible and blocked off by the current landowners. So although the cave is of historic importance and is one of the largest caves in Connecticut, it is no longer accessible, but it's still interesting that Connecticut had this tour cave back in the 1870s. You don't really think of Connecticut as a state where a tour cave would exist. But there were other caves that were tour caves in Connecticut as well, and another one of those is Monroe Cave, what's also known as the Boys Halfway River Cave. And this was in the 1880s. This was discovered by a local man, and he proceeded to buy the property and dig out the cave to make it accessible for people to enter. And in doing so, he actually exposed an interesting series of arched tunnels and all sorts of what he called attractions in the cave. This cave also is a little bit on the mysterious side because it was said that a very large room was discovered underground that was 30 foot by 40 foot, and it was called the King's Ballroom. It's even said that he dug through a passage and encountered an underground stream deep in the cave. So like Twin Lakes Cave, this cave also had a dance platform. The area was called Wildwood. There were omnibuses, like horse-drawn large carriages that would bring up tourists from the railroad. And it was kind of like a place where the Victorian era vacationers would kind of hang out. And this was really before the advent of amusement parks. So these caves and these natural places were really the place to be back in the 1880s. And there are all sorts of legends associated with this cave. Like one room was supposed to have chairs and a table carved into the marble for the Victorian vacationers to hang out in. But unfortunately, sometime in the early 20th century, the cave entrance was blown up. So the cave is on the property of a convent. And at some point in the early 20th century, the nuns thought that the cave was maybe a danger to people, or people could get stuck or lost in there. So they actually had the entrance blown up. So that is until 2017. And some local people from the town here in Monroe reached out to me about possibly reopening this cave and finding the entrance and seeing what's still underground. The first thing was to find the entrance to the cave. Since it had been blown up, the location was essentially lost. So when I went out there, I looked for blasted rock. So I looked for drill holes. And it wasn't too long before I found some big 2-inch drill holes. And that was the entrance to where the cave was. So we pulled out big rocks, and we actually filmed the first entering of this cave since these early dates. So when I entered, I found this beautiful carved marble, and the cave was actually still intact. The blasting of the entrance had not damaged the cave itself. I did notice that some of the marble in the cave had been removed, and we know that in the 1820s, they actually removed some of the marble and roasted it to make lime for fertilizing farmers' fields. So at one point, this marble was removed, and I could still see signs of that in the cave. The only thing is, when I entered this cave and we explored the passageways, we did not find the king's ballroom, we did not find an underground stream, we did not find archways, and it didn't really match the description of the New York Times articles from the 1880s. So we started a dig in the cave, and some people from the Central Connecticut Grotto came out, and we actually removed enough dirt to get about 20 feet farther into the cave. This passage actually had a like a sump with some standing water. It wasn't very deep, and it had some interesting water carved features in it. So we knew that water had been flowing through here at one point. But where was the underground stream? So we kept digging without too much luck. We did not find the king's ballroom. We did not find really anything that you can call an arch tunnel. And maybe it's still there. Maybe we just need to go a little bit farther. But at the moment, the project has sort of stalled. And although these first couple rooms in this cave have been explored, there may still be more to be found deep underground in Monroe. So Monroe Cave was actually thought sort of to be a hoax by a lot of people. The New York Times articles just sounded way too fanciful. It talked about there being Native American artifacts found in there and all sorts of really outlandish claims that the cave extended miles underground. But this was actually not uncommon in the 1800s to over-exaggerate these caves. And there's another cave in Connecticut called COLEBROOK Cave that was probably actually a hoax. It was mentioned in a book in the 1840s that talked about this very extensive tunnel system and this very large proportion tunnel leading into the hillside. And the cave was at some point in the 1800s lost again, and I believe in the early 1900s found, but then again lost. And there's no proof that it ever really existed. There's no photographs of the interior of the cave. So I went looking for it in 2018. And so we went way out into the woods. We actually found the area where we believe the cave was, called a hillside called Witch's Retreat. And it's this boulder-strewn hillside. And we could see immediately that this hillside had potential for caves, but for talus caves. There were a lot of rocks that had fallen in all sorts of ways that created these passageways that led a little ways into the hill and then dead-ended or maybe looked like cave entrances. So we felt we were in the right area. I did find a spot that looked like maybe dynamite was detonated, and there are some stories about people in the 1930s detonating dynamite to try to widen these entrances to get into what they believed was the COLEBROOK Cave. This is one situation where I actually believe that the cave was most likely a hoax. So there is a cave in Connecticut that, unlike COLEBROOK Cave, is very well documented, and that's Judge's Cave in New Haven. And this cave goes all the way back to Charles I of England, who was actually beheaded by Parliament, and there were judges on Parliament that signed his death warrant that were later hunted down when Charles II, the son of Charles I, was instated as King of England. The judges that signed the death warrant of his father were in big trouble. So they arrived in Boston thinking that they would be completely safe here, but little did they know that there were some agents of the king that were actually hot on their trail, and they fled down to Connecticut, and they ended up hiding in this cave. And they stayed in this cave for a good while, and people would bring them food, until one night they heard this blood-curdling cry outside the cave, and it was actually a mountain lion that was right outside the cave. So they kind of realized this was not a good idea. So they ended up moving and hiding out in someone's house in Milford, and then eventually in Hadley, Massachusetts, which was in the 1600s the absolute edge of civilization. And this cave is very well documented, and it's even found on maps going back to the 1700s. So it was actually a revered location even then. And of course today it's an excellent destination for hikers that are interested in some really good views of New Haven and of course some old New England history. So these judges that signed the death warrant of Charles I, they weren't the only people in Connecticut history that used caves to hide out. So a little over 100 years later, during the American Revolution, Tories, who were people sympathetic to the King of England, would hide out in caves. So anyone who was a loyalist in Connecticut at that time would probably be best off getting out of the colony or going into hiding. And a lot of these caves have the name Tories Cave. So one of the most famous Tories Cave in Connecticut is in New Milford, and it's right along the Housatonic River. And this is actually a marble water-carved cave. And it's certainly not as extensive as Twin Lakes Cave, but it is a spot where people could have hid out in the 1700s, although it would have been a very wet existence in this cave because there is a stream that feeds water into it. So as legend goes, they actually hid in this cave and even stored supplies and munitions in there. And as legend has it, the cave exited on the Housatonic River. So there was a lower portion of the cave that came out on the Housatonic, and that could be used as an escape route if they were ever found. I've explored this cave very thoroughly, and I never found any indication of a tunnel that could have led to the Housatonic. So it's actually really interesting to think the length that these people went to hide out in this cave back in the 1700s. And the cave today is actually a bat hibernaculum, so it's a place where bats can take refuge. So there's another cave in Connecticut that actually has a date carved in the wall of 1770. And this probably wouldn't have been done by a Tory because this is before the Revolutionary War. So it wouldn't have been a time when Tories would have been hiding out in the caves. But it's just interesting that someone was here at that time that spent enough time in this cave to carve this very deep incised date of 1770 into the wall. But the interesting part of this cave's history actually takes place later on. So in the 1800s, there were some men that were working on building the railroad here, and they actually found a small gold nugget in this stream called Spruce Brook. So they began panning the stream and trying to find more, but soon had to get back to work on the railroad, and nothing ever really came of it. Until about 1915, there was a German man who was hired to cut wood in the area. And he was actually said to be a very educated man, and as legend has it, he actually found a gold nugget in this stream, in Spruce Brook. So at some point, a little bit later on, he was seen in the general store buying drill steels, gunpowder, picks and shovels, all the stuff needed for mining. But no one knows if he actually found a significant amount of gold up there or not. He was very secretive, and he lived in a little hut near the cave, and the foundation of that can still be seen today. He would come into town to the general store every now and then and pay for supplies with gold coins. And we know that he was not paid in gold by the railroad. So did he get these gold coins by selling the gold he found here in, say, New York or Boston? We don't really know, because about 5 years later, Dutchy went missing. So people did come across his camp, found that it was abandoned, and they did find that there were certain things missing, so they felt like maybe he actually took off for some place unknown. They did search the area just in case he had died somewhere in the area, but his body was never found. So I did check out this cave in 2019 with Michael Girard, and we did do a thorough investigation of the cave. I felt like the geology was actually similar to the Rook's gold mine in Vermont, and we did find drill holes in the cave where drilling and blasting had been done, so someone was mining inside this cave. But was gold ever found here? It's probably not likely, but we really may never know until we do a more thorough investigation of the cave and the legend of Dutchy. So although Dutchy was never found, there is a Connecticut cave called Dead Man's Cave where a body was found. And this was back in 1873, and some people went up to look for the cave. And when they found the entrance, they actually found a partially decomposed body, which is where the cave got its name, Dead Man's Cave. I believe it was called Abraham's Cave before that time. The body was eventually identified as Edward Barnum, who was actually a nephew of the famous showman P.T. Barnum. And we don't really know if this was a suicide and he went up to the cave to be secluded, or if it was an accident and he was exploring the cave and something happened. But the legends of this cave have just continued, and generation after generation of kids have gone up to this cave to see the place where P.T. Barnum's nephew was found dead. And you can find just decades and decades of graffiti in this cave. So I did check out this cave in 2018, and actually I even recently LiDAR mapped it to create a 3D map of this interesting series of tunnels that descends into the hillside and kind of winds its way deep underground. So as you can guess, most of the caves in Connecticut are talus caves, basically just jumbles of rock that have formed spaces in between. And another cave, like Dead Man's Cave, that's a talus cave with lots of places to explore in between, is Compound's Cave in Bristol. And we don't know if this is actually the Compound's Cave that was shown in this old photograph, or if this is a separate cave, but there's so many jumbled rock caves in this area that it would be very hard to pinpoint this exact one. So this cave got its name from a Tungus chief named John Compounds. So this, as the story goes, back in 1684, Compounds attempted to swim across this lake down below the cave, and he had recently purchased a brass kettle. And there's a few versions of this story. One has him actually sitting inside this enormous kettle and paddling across the lake, but accidentally capsizing it and drowning. Another version has him actually hanging a small kettle around his neck as he swam across the lake and being dragged underwater. And finally, another version of the story has him actually taking his own life in the lake after selling his people's land for really just a trifle, just a very small amount of money and a few objects of little value. But these series of caves are really interesting. They're very complex, and they really represent a typical Connecticut cave. So I would say the most famous cave involving a Native American is King Philip's Cave. So this cave is a little bit more interesting because this is actually a lava tube cave. This is formed in a basalt ridge, and we actually climbed up to this cave to check it out, and we found all sorts of copper minerals in the basalt, which was actually a really unexpected surprise after climbing up to this pretty hard to reach cave. So the story here is that during King Philip's War, when King Philip's people were raiding Simsbury and actually burning Simsbury in 1676, King Philip sat in this cave and overlooked the burning of Simsbury. And you could see from the view up here that this is definitely a plausible story. But these lava tube caves are actually pretty neat, and I have seen other similar lava tube caves in Connecticut. And Connecticut certainly is not known for its lava tubes, but if you get out there and you really explore these basalt ridges, you'll find other caves like this, and they all have crystals and sometimes minerals like copper minerals. But there's actually a few more stories that involve Native Americans and caves. And there's one cave called SQUAW'S Cave, and this is a water-carved marble cave in Bolton Notch. And it's supposedly the site where a Native American woman hid her Dutch husband when he was being pursued. There's one version that has an Indian squaw being given some whiskey to go in to explore the cave to see what was inside it. There's another version that has her hiding her fugitive Dutch husband in the cave, which that story is very elaborate. We don't really know what the story is behind the cave, but it's one of a very few marble caves in Connecticut. So another famous Native American cave in Connecticut is Mudis Cave, and this is one cave I've not gotten a chance to visit yet. So I hope to visit it at some point, but I'll tell the story of the cave anyway because it has such an interesting story. So the name Mudis comes from the Native American word Macamudis, which means place of noises. So the first time these noises were documented by a white settler was in 1729 by Reverend Stephen Hosmer. So he actually described the noises as sounding like small arms fire. So pistols being fired deep underground, that's kind of what he related the sound as being similar to. And he actually kept track of these noises over a period of 20 years. But when the Native Americans were asked, why these noises were coming from this cave deep underground, they replied that their god was displeased that the Englishman's god had come to their land. So there is another story that's similar to this just across the Connecticut River in what was at the time Wallingford. There was a copper mine there, and the locals in that area in the 1700s called this noise that would come from deep underground the roaring of the mines. And it's also on this basalt ridge where there was probably some sort of small earthquakes taking place underground. But it was said these noises would be heard during an equinoctial storm. So a storm taking place during the equinox, which was thought to have some bearing on these noises deep underground. So this site may be completely unrelated to Moodus, but it's sort of a similar story that goes back to the very first settlers in the area. So I hope you enjoyed this film on historic caves of Connecticut. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more caves in Connecticut, and probably even more legends of caves that have not yet been confirmed to be true. And I'll be sure to update you as new finds are being made.